Είμαστε εδώ στο Εθνικό και Αρχαιολογικό Μουσείο. Είμαστε στο μεγαλύτερο μουσείο της χώρας. Αισθανόμενοι όλοι, φαντάζομαι, και τη συγκίνηση και το βάρος και την ευθύνη να είμαστε σε ένα τόσο σπουδαίο πολιτιστικό φορέα του τόπου. Πριν ξεκινήσουμε και μπούμε στο περιεχόμενο αυτής της συνάντησης, να σας ενημερώσω όλους και για λόγους προσωπικών δεδομένων, αλλά και για χρηστικούς καθαρά λόγους, ότι η όλη εκδήλωση, αυτός ο πρώτος κύκλος επιστημονικών συζητήσεων, μεταδίδεται σε απευθεία σύνδεση, live streaming όπως λέμε σε άπτεστα ελληνικά, και στο διαδίκτυο. Αυτό για να το γνωρίζουμε και για τα προσωπικά μας δεδομένα, αλλά και γιατί μπορεί να επικοινωνήσετε τη δράση σε γνωστούς και οικείους. Είμαι πάρα πολύ χαρούμενος, γιατί θέλω να ελπίζω ότι εκλήθη εδώ από την διεύθυνση και τη διοίκηση του μουσείου όχι ως δημοσιογράφος, αλλά ως αρχαιολόγος, ως άνθρωπος που ασχολείται με τον πολιτισμό και σε μεταπτυχιακό και σε διδακτορικό επίπεδο, για να κοιτάξουμε τα μουσεία και την κοινωνία έχοντας το βλέμμα μας στο 2050. Όχι δηλαδή πολύ κοντά, στο 30, όχι σε ένα κάποιο βάθος στο 40, αλλά στο 50, που μας δίνει τη δυνατότητα αυτές οι κουβέντες που θα κάνουν να γίνουν και έργο, να γίνουν πράξη. Και αυτός ο κύκλος των επιστημονικών συναντήσεων ξεκινά σήμερα με μια πάρα πολύ ωραία συνάντηση με τον καθηγητή του Κολούμπια, τον κύριο Άνταμ Σόμπελ, ο οποίος έκανε πολλά χιλιόμετρα αεροπορικός για να είναι εδώ κοντά μας, να μιλήσουμε για το κλίμα. Ξέρετε, τα μουσεία, όποιος διαβάσει τον πιο σύγχρονο ορισμό του μουσείου, αυτό που ψηφίστηκε στην Πράγα τον Αύγουστο του 2022, θα καταλάβει πολύ εύκολα ότι τα μουσεία δεν είναι αυτό που έχουμε στο μυαλό μας ως απλή περαστική χώροι συλλογής, συντήρησης και έκθεσης αντικειμένων. Είναι προφανώς και αυτό, αλλά πολλά περισσότερα από αυτό. Ένα από αυτά, τα πολλά περισσότερα, το εμπνεύστηκε και η Γενική Διευθύντρια του Μουσείου, η κυρία Άννα Βασιλική Καραπαναγιώτου, να ξεκινούν κουβέντες δηλαδή, να γίνεται ένας διάλογος πάνω σε πολύ κρίσιμα ζητήματα που αφορούν όχι μόνο τη χώρα μας, αλλά την ανθρωπότητα. Και γι' αυτό, πριν υποδεχτούμε τον καθηγητή, με πολύ μεγάλη χαρά, θέλω να υποδεχτώ τη Γενική Διευθύντρια του Μουσείου, την κυρία Καραπαναγιώτου, να έρθετε εδώ, να υποδεχτείτε ως γνήσια οικοδέσποινα τους προσκεκλημένους και εμάς που είμαστε εδώ και όσοι είναι διαδικτυακά, να μας πείτε αυτό που νιώθω εγώ ότι έχω ανάγκη να ακούσω, πώς σκεφτήκατε ότι πρέπει να ξεκινήσουν αυτές οι δράσεις, αυτή η κύκλη των επιστημονικών συναντήσεων, που αν κανείς διαβάσει το δελτίο τύπου θα πει ότι είναι 3, αλλά είμαι βέβαιος ότι όταν υπάρχει ένα τέτοιο όραμα θα είναι πολύ περισσότεροι στη συνέχεια και δεν το γνωρίζετε ακόμα καλά ούτε εσείς. Κυρία Διευθύντρια, ελάτε εδώ στο βήμα να μας καλωσορίσετε.
Κύριε Πρόεδρε του Διοικητικού Συμβουλίου του Εθνικού Αρχαιολογικού Μουσείου, κύριε καθηγητά Άνταμ Σόμπελ, αγαπητέ Κώστα, κυρίες και κύριοι, με πολύ μεγάλη χαρά σας υποδεχόμαστε σήμερα στην έναρξη του πρώτου κύκλου των επιστημονικών συναντήσεων του Εθνικού Αρχαιολογικού Μουσείου. Στόχος αυτής της νέας και όπως προσδοκώ πρωτοποριακής δράσης του Μουσείου μας είναι πολύ συνοπτικά να αναδείξει τις πολλαπλές προκλήσεις και τους πολυεπίπεδους ρόλους που καλείται να παίξει σήμερα ένα μουσείο σε τοπικό, εθνικό και διεθνές επίπεδο. Το ερώτημα ή τα πολλά ερωτήματα που τίθενται είναι: τι είναι μουσείο σήμερα? Πώς φανταζόμαστε το μουσείο του 2050? Και βέβαια δεν περιορίζομαι μόνο στο Εθνικό Αρχαιολογικό Μουσείο, το μεγαλύτερο μουσείο της χώρας, αλλά γενικότερα σε θέματα μουσιακής πολιτικής. Σε αυτά και πολλά ερωτήματα θα κληθούν να τοποθετηθούν και να συζητήσουν μαζί μας ερευνητές, επιστήμονες και διανοούμενοι από την Ελλάδα και το εξωτερικό. Ο πρώτος κύκλος, όπως βλέπετε στην οθόνη σας, έχει ως θέμα την κλιματική αλλαγή και τα μουσεία. Η κλιματική κρίση είναι μία κρίση πολιτισμού και επομένως φαντασίας, κατά τη ρίση του Άμιταβ Γκος το 2016. η κλιματική αλλαγή, η περιβαλλοντική συνείδηση, η βιοποικιλότητα, ο πράσινος τρόπος σκέψης των μουσείων σε διεθνές επίπεδο, οι στόχοι της βιώσιμης ανάπτυξης, αλλά και ο χωροταξικός και πολεοδομικός σχεδιασμός είναι κάποιοι από τους άξονες που θα συζητηθούν σε αυτό τον πρώτο κύκλο. Ο κύκλος αυτός ξεκινάει με τον καθηγητή Άνταμ Σόμπελ από το Πανεπιστήμιο Κολούμπια, από την Αμερική. Συνεχίζεται με τον καθηγητή κύριο Γιώργο Περεβελάκη από τη Σορβόνη και ολοκληρώνεται με τον καθηγητή Κώστα Καρτάλη, εκεί γύρω στα μέσα Ιουνίου, και είναι ένας τρόπος και μία δράση που παράλληλα ακολουθεί και το πρόγραμμα των δράσεων τόσο του ΙΚΟΜ όσο και της Διεθνούς ημέρας Περιβάλλοντος, που είναι η 5η Ιουνίου, όπως γίνεται κάθε χρόνο. Ακολουθεί μετά τις καλοκαιρινές διακοπές για φέτος, αγαπητέ Κώστα, ένας δεύτερος κύκλος, ο οποίος εκεί φέρνει πιο κοντά σε μας τους αρχιτέκτονες, τους ανθρώπους που δουλεύουν μαζί με τους αρχαιολόγους και το προσωπικό των μουσείων, για αυτό που λέμε μουσιολογικός και μουσιογραφικός σχεδιασμός, και στον κύκλο αυτό οι αρχιτέκτονες, όπως είπα, έχουν τον πρώτο λόγο. Μουσεία τοπόσημα, κτηριακό και έλειφος ως σημείο αναφορά σε μία πόλη, αρχιτεκτονικές επιλογές για μουσεία που δημιούργησαν τάσεις ανά τον κόσμο. Αυτός θα είναι ο δεύτερος μας κύκλος. Πολύ σύντομα θα δείτε και τους ομιλητές που αυτή τη φορά σχεδόν αποκλειστικά έρχονται από το εξωτερικό, αν θυμάμαι καλά, αλλά θα το δούμε, είναι κατά το διάστημα Οκτωβρίου-Νοεμβρίου. Την επόμενη χρονιά μπαίνουμε στα πιο δικά μας, κυρίες και κύριοι. Τι εννοώ? Στα θέματα πραγματικά των μουσείων, των μουσιολογικών θεμάτων, των εκθεσιακών αφηγήσεων, και ευελπιστούμε ότι η δράση αυτή θα συνεχίζεται καθ' όλη τη διάρκεια του μεγάλου προγράμματος που όλοι γνωρίζουμε, της επέκτασης του Εθνικού Αρχαιολογικού Μουσείου και της αναβάθμισής του. Θα παρακολουθεί και θα παρακολουθείτε. Θα έχουμε τη δυνατότητα να συνομιλήσουμε στο πλαίσιο της προετοιμασίας όλου αυτού του έργου και να ακούσουμε απόψεις από την υπόλοιπη Ευρώπη, την Εσπερία και την Δύση και την Αμερική, αλλά και την από Ανατολή, σε θέματα που μας απασχολούν και θα μας απασχολήσουν. Πρέπει τέλος να πω ότι πολλές από τις σκέψεις και σημεία για τη διοργάνωση αυτής της νέας δράσης του Εθνικού Αρχαιολογικού Μουσείου μπορείτε να τα βρείτε στο τελευταίο βιβλίο του Κώστα Λασκαράτου, «Τα μουσεία ως influencers». Είχα τη χαρά να το διαβάσω, γιατί πριν από 2-3 μήνες, όχι περισσότερο, το παρουσίασα μαζί με άλλους εκλεκτούς συνομιλητές σε μία εκδήλωση. Ναι, όντως πιστεύω, Κώστα, ότι τα μουσεία μπορούν και πρέπει να επιδρούν και να αλληλεπιδρούν με την κοινωνία. Σας ευχαριστώ πολύ.
Και με αυτόν τον ωραίο τρόπο πηγαίνουμε σιγά σιγά και στη Διεθνή ημέρα των Μουσείων, 18 Μαΐου, άρα το γεγονός ότι ξεκινά αυτή τόσο ενδιαφέρουσα και πρωτοποριακή δράση και πολύτιμη δράση είναι ουσιαστική σημασίας τον Μάιο, λίγες μέρες απόσταση από τη Διεθνή ημέρα των Μουσείων, από το κεντρικότερο μουσείο της χώρας, έχει αυτό το συμβολισμό του. Μπορεί για εσάς, για κάποιους από εσάς που κινείστε στο χώρο εδώ τακτικά, είτε με τη μορφή της διοίκησης, της διεύθυνσης, είτε ως εργαζόμενοι, είτε ως τακτικοί επισκέπτες, κάποιες εικόνες να είναι συνήθειες. συνήθεις, αλλά το να είσαι σε έναν χώρο με τέτοιες σημαντικές αρχαιότητες, με τον μικρό Ιππέα στα λίγα μέτρα, αλλά και με πρωτοβουλίες δυνατές του μουσείου, όπως εδώ τα εκθέματα για τους ανθρώπους οι οποίοι έχουν προβλήματα όρασης και κάνουν το μουσείο και σύγχρονο και συμπεριληπτικό, δεν είναι καθόλου αμεληταίο, οπότε πρέπει να το επισημάνουμε. Δεν θέλω να φάω άλλο από το χρόνο του καθηγητή που είναι ο φιλοξενούμενος σήμερα, ο καθηγητής εφαρμοσμένης φυσικής, εφαρμοσμένων μαθηματικών και επιστημών της γης και του περιβάλλοντος, στο Πανεπιστήμιο της Κολούμπια, τον καθηγητή τον Άνταμ Σόμπελ, έχουμε κοντά μας. Θα τον υποδεχτούμε με ένα θερμό χειροκρότημα και με μεγάλη προσοχή θα τον παρακολουθήσουμε. Κύριε καθηγητά.
Thank you, Kostas, Madam Director, and all the staff here for making it possible for me to give this talk at this really amazing and important institution. It's a great honor. Thank you all for coming. Let's see, I better start the slides. How doomed are we? As a working climate scientist, it's a question I've been asked many times over the years when I give a public talk like this or in social situations when I meet someone and they learn what I do. They ask me this. I struggle to answer it every time. It's not a scientific question because the terms are not well defined. What does it mean to be doomed? And who is we? I want to talk about these two questions and a third one that we'll get to later tonight. I'll talk about them in the context of climate, which is my area of expertise, as you've heard, and the theme of this new lecture series, as you know, at this remarkable institution. But what do people really mean when they ask this question? I'm not always sure. Maybe some people really mean it in the most extreme and literal sense. Maybe they've got the idea that global warming really is going to single-handedly wipe out the human species in the near future. In that case, it's easy to talk them down because the evidence doesn't support that prediction. Maybe it comes about through media confusion between two different messages that come out of the actual scientific evidence. On the one hand, there are statements that time is running out to meet dramatic emissions reduction targets in order to stay under specific amounts of global average warming, such as 1.5 C or 2 C, Celsius, how many degrees of warming. And that's shown on this slide from the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, the IPCC, which indicates the history of carbon emissions in the beginning of the graph with time on the x-axis. And then the rapid change that we would need to stay under these warming targets as set by the Paris Agreement. So that's one thing. That's how time is running out. We have to change very rapidly. So that much warming, let's say 1.5 or 2 degrees, will be bad, and it's worth tremendous effort to avoid it. But it won't be the end of humanity by itself. On the other hand, there are projections of truly catastrophic impacts from climate change, but those only become likely at substantially more warming than 1.5 or 2 C, which is only potentially going to happen in the much further future if we don't act. So both these things are true, but they're two different things. But in any case, I think that whether we're really all going to die soon is not what most people are asking when they ask, are we doomed? I think mostly they mean to ask a more subtle question. Something like, as somebody who understands the science on climate change better than most people, what is your emotional reaction to it? How scared are you? And some of them are really asking the other third most common question, which is, what can we do about it? But I'll come back to that one later. So fear, of course, is an emotion. Nobody can tell us the right amount of it to feel, even in response to well-defined and specific facts. If you knew you were going to die in 6 months, how much fear would you feel? And what would you do in response to that? Is there any reason to expect that everyone else would react the same way, or that they should? These are profound questions worthy of deep reflection, but you wouldn't go to a scientist for the answers to them. Of course, we scientists can provide some facts and some predictions, or rather projections, the difference being that a projection is a statement of what will happen if something else happens or doesn't happen. So this graph from the IPCC also shows projections of temperature change with the different curves showing different scenarios where we humans do more or less to limit greenhouse gas emissions. Those are the different curves. And the shaded regions around each curve show our best estimates of the uncertainty of what will happen if we make those choices. Again, in terms of global average temperature change over time. So we know it's warming. We know about how fast it's warming and how the future of that depends on human actions. And at a broad level, we know what many of the impacts will be. But when we look more closely and ask about the societal consequences of that warming, things get blurrier and harder to predict. And that's partly because of climate uncertainties, uncertainties about the science of climate, but even more because those uncertainties by themselves are only part of the story. But since I'm a climate scientist, let's talk a little bit more specifically first about what we know and what we don't know about climate, and I'm going to spend some time on that. The global scale increase in temperature, besides being the simplest and most predictable dimension of climate change, is also the one that scares me personally the most, partly because the direction of change is so certain, we know that it's getting warmer, and partly because heat is such a persistent and widespread hazard. And this was the slide I meant to show for that. For the large fraction of the world where it's already hot during some or all of the year, just a couple of degrees of warming will cause great societal harm. In places with cooler climates, like much of Europe and the United States, severe heat waves can sometimes be even more deadly, though, particularly for the most vulnerable people in those places, because we are less accustomed to extreme heat. Some other aspects of climate change are broadly similar to heat in that we are at least certain about the direction of change, if not the rate. And sea level, which this slide illustrates, is an example, an important example. We know the sea level is going up, for sure. We only don't know how fast and how far. So this slide shows sea level rise projections, maybe a little hard to see, in a format similar to the temperature projections that I just showed earlier, but the uncertainties are much larger, especially going out further into the future, as shown on the right there, where the bar shows that by 2300, we could have outcomes that would be truly catastrophic, many meters of sea level rise, which would be really a disaster for coastal cities. Some other hazards that are related to water are also in a similar category. That is, we know the hazards are increasing, if not exactly how fast. Extreme rainfall events are becoming heavier, and hydrological droughts, the absence of water in soil and reservoirs, are made worse by faster evaporation of water from hotter soils and plants, even if rainfall doesn't change. And wildfires are increasing for similar reasons. With some other hazards, though, even the direction of change is not certain. We don't know if we should expect hurricanes, which is my area of specialty, to become more frequent or less frequent, whether we'll have more of them or fewer of them in the future. We do know that each hurricane on average is getting more dangerous because of strengthening winds and rain due to climate change, and storm surge, which happens when the winds push the ocean on the land, will cause worse coastal flooding as sea level rises, just because the water already starts from a higher place to begin with, before the storm arrives. But still, if hurricanes were really to happen less often, as some models predict, then it's theoretically possible for the overall risk to decrease from hurricanes. I don't think that's likely, but we can't rule it out. And there are more uncertain things. In many places, we can't confidently predict whether the average rain that falls in a year, the average amount of rain, will increase or decrease, and thus whether meteorological drought, the lack of rain, will become more or less prevalent. Changes in severe convective storms, that is, the kind of storms that produce tornadoes and hail, which we've seen in the United States in the last few weeks, are subject to especially big uncertainties. And these uncertainties are due not just to limitations in our understanding of the various types of extreme weather themselves, but also the patterns of regional climate change that will influence where the changes go one way versus another. Many climate scientists, including me, have now become concerned that our models may be misrepresenting the pattern of sea surface temperature change in the tropical Pacific Ocean, which, if so, will have big consequences for our understanding of other aspects of climate change. So we're going to do a little more science here. This is a slide about the thing called El Nino. You might have heard about El Nino and La Nina events. We have been in an El Nino for the last year, and this slide depicts some of the different things that typically happen in El Nino around the world. And we're in a transition now to a La Nina event, which often follows El Nino, and that has the opposite effects, more or less, around the world. For example, an El Nino makes fewer hurricanes in the Atlantic, and a La Nina makes more hurricanes in the Atlantic. These events have long occurred naturally. They have opposite patterns of sea surface temperature change in the Pacific. El Nino is anomalously warm there, as shown here. La Nina is anomalously cold. And these have, as I've just mentioned, opposite effects on regional climate all over the world. El Nino causes floods in some places, droughts in others, and fires, more hurricanes than usual in some places and others, and fewer in others. And La Nina reverses those patterns. So now here's the uncertainty. Our models say that global warming should produce a trend, a long-term shift towards a state more similar to El Nino, more El Ninos, on average, at least over the next few decades. But this has not been borne out so far by observations. Instead, we have been seeing a trend towards more La Nina, the opposite of what the models have predicted. So are the models wrong, or is this just an accident due to the normal random fluctuations of the climate system, which make it hard to establish long-term trends when something is fluctuating up and down? Erroneous patterns of Pacific trends could, by analogy to the historical El Ninos and La Ninas, cause the models to get patterns of change in these other hazards backwards. So here are maps showing at the top the changes over the next 30 years in sea surface temperature, and then below that in hurricane activity. These are shown in the colors, with red meaning more hurricanes and blue meaning fewer, over the next few decades predicted by climate models. And the observed changes over the last few decades, when we've had already some global warming, are the opposite of that. So this is what's happened in the observations. The upper pattern with blue in the east is more like La Nina, and therefore there are fewer hurricanes in the Pacific, shown by blue, and more in the Atlantic. So that's what's actually happened. The models say that this is what should happen, which looks more like El Nino. And if I go between them, you can see on the bottom that the hurricanes changes are opposite to what the models say. So this could be just by chance, because there's a lot of natural variability. And that makes it hard to see the effects of climate change sometimes. But it's also possible that our models are just wrong. These are very complicated computer models. They're just maybe wrong about the pattern of change caused by warming. And that's a big uncertainty, because it'll have different ramifications for climate worldwide. Now, in the big picture, we know everywhere will still get warmer. None of this uncertainty changes that. We need to stop emitting carbon, and that conclusion won't change. But as specific and local climate information is increasingly being desired for many purposes, especially purposes related to climate adaptation, our lack of confidence in our models on this issue is a serious problem, and I'll come back to that in a bit. Particularly concerning also is the possibility of what's called tipping points. These are large and possibly abrupt and irreversible changes with planetary scale consequences. So examples could include the rapid loss of major chunks of the Greenland or Antarctic ice sheets, which would cause a large sea level rise that wouldn't be reversible any time in the future, near future, or emission of large amounts of methane, which is a greenhouse gas from melted permafrost in the Arctic or sea bottom sediments, or the shutdown of the so-called Atlantic thermohaline circulation, the deep ocean circulation, as well. In the near term, the probabilities of all of these are low, all of these catastrophic outcomes, but although they're low probabilities, it's hard to be sure and to estimate those probabilities with confidence. So all these dimensions of the climate problem are scary, and the uncertainties make it scarier because they mean that some things may well get worse faster than we expect. For example, we always expected warming to increase wildfires in the western United States, but I don't think anyone predicted that it would become as bad as it has, as quickly as it has. And even here in Athens, as I'm sure you all know better than me, there have been wildfires just in the last year, as shown in this news story. So despite all of this, the climate science itself is not really what keeps me awake at night. I have much less climate anxiety, as we say, than some people do. And maybe that's because my profession has trained me to view the problem clinically so that I'm disconnected from my emotions on this topic. But I think the bigger reason is that, to me, climate can be only one part of the story, and some of the other parts scare me more, especially in the short term. So for example, the ongoing wars in Gaza and Ukraine are already catastrophic for the people in those places, but they could become much more so for many more people if they expand, not to mention the possibilities of new wars in a world with many nuclear-armed nations. Loss of biodiversity and major ecosystems, as is occurring in the Amazon, is an immediate global scale problem. The rise of artificial intelligence creates risks, I think, for our species, our human species, even if our ability to assess them now, to know what those risks really are, is very speculative. Perhaps most disturbing to me personally is the democratic backsliding we have seen in my own country, the United States, as well as others. Democracy itself is in trouble. And this threatens our ability to handle all the other crises in a responsible way, and also tends to create new ones as authoritarians consolidate and express their power in ways that harm many people, but especially the most vulnerable and those who oppose them. So climate is related to all of these problems in one way or another, but by no means is it the primary or decisive factor. As scary as many direct impacts of climate change will be, at 2 degrees warming or beyond, as we seem quite likely to be before too many decades pass, they start to be scary indeed. The greatest harm, at least in the near term, will come from climate's role as a so-called threat multiplier, meaning that it compounds other hazards. So to take one example, we're already seeing large rates of migration from the global south to the US and Europe. I don't need to explain that here in Greece. So to what extent this has been caused by persecution, war, economic opportunism, climate, or any other cause is a question I am not qualified to answer. But I do know that the challenges of receiving large numbers of migrants, real though they are, have been weaponized politically by the far right in the global north. And this weaponization has already been destabilizing to our democracies. And to the extent that climate could accelerate that, it increases many other risks, including those of wars. So if warming increases migration, and formerly stable democracies become right-wing authoritarian states, should we call that a climate impact or a consequence of our polarized and dysfunctional politics? How likely would it be to happen anyway in a world with no warming? I don't know. I just know that this is the outcome that scares me the most, both because I don't want to live in such a state myself and because I fear what would happen to the world as a whole in such a scenario. It's worth pausing here to point out that there are also great positive trends in the world. On climate in particular, the clean energy transition now looks unstoppable to a degree many of us couldn't have imagined a few years ago. So this slide, it's a little bit hard to read, but the graph on the right shows how solar and wind energy have very quickly become cheaper now than other forms of energy in much of the world. So it's now just a question of how fast and how far the energy transition goes in comparison to the time that's running out to keep under warming targets. And politically, an optimist could focus on the reaction to the democratic backsliding and imagine corrections that strengthen democracy. Positive social change is often hard to see before it happens, and there has been a lot of it in my lifetime and yours. So think of how quickly gay marriage became accepted in the United States and now in Greece too, once its social tipping point, as you might say, came. So maybe such things can happen on a broader range of issues. So my point is not that we are doomed. It's that whether we feel doomed or not is not a choice we can make rationally. It's an emotional response to diverse, confusing, contradictory information and trends whose future outcomes we cannot know. It's hard to accept this. There's a natural human desire to know the future, and in some contexts, we do. Of course, we know that each of us individually is doomed. Death is a certainty. The only question is when or where. And in my own field, to make it a little less philosophical, we've become very good at predicting the weather a few days in advance, something that was not conceivable in past centuries. It's a great achievement of modern science. So seen in this context, climate uncertainties should not be seen as representing scientific failure. All those very real uncertainties notwithstanding, we can still predict climate change better than we can predict most developments in human society. When it comes to social and political developments, we can envision possibilities, think concretely about risks and opportunities, and on climate, we can state with some confidence some consequences of certain choices that we as human beings collectively make, whether through action or inaction. But who really believes they can envision life on Earth in 2050, let alone 2100, to the point of being able to quantify the probabilities of specific outcomes on a planetary scale with or without climate change? In ancient Greek tragedies, to attempt a reference at something directly relevant here, the profound works created here in Athens that still influence our thinking today, the gods and the audience know in advance the terrible futures that are coming. But of course, the protagonists don't know them, and that's us in this story. Science has not achieved the abilities of an omniscient oracle, and I'm pretty sure it never will. So this is a cover of a book by Isaac Asimov, an American science fiction writer who, writing in the mid-20th century, envisioned a field of psychohistory that could predict the trajectory of all human society far into the future. But to my knowledge, that remains science fiction. And even if we did know the future, there wouldn't be a right way to feel about it. For that matter, how good or bad is the present moment right now? It's not just a question of personal temperament, but also our position in the world. And here it becomes appropriate to ask, who is we? The we that is either doomed or not doomed. So Amitav Ghosh, the director, mentioned in the introductory remarks, and he's a great writer who has become one of the world's most insightful thinkers on climate, and full disclosure, he's also a friend of mine. And he's written that existential fears about the world's end due to climate change are really Western fears about the end of colonial power. Because in much of the rest of the world, and for indigenous people most of all, but many others as well, the catastrophe has already happened. That's a quote. For those in the global north who are searching for the right way to feel about the climate crisis, I think it's worth pondering this. On the other hand, for climate communicators and activists, many discussions about emotions treat them instrumentally as a question of strategy. Some criticize doomers, people who focus on the potential for the worst outcomes, arguing that negative messaging turns off many people and makes them less likely to act on climate, for example. I'm skeptical of that. I'm skeptical of anyone who claims to know the connection between emotions and climate action. So let's consider the youth climate movement over the last decade. The message of Greta Thunberg and many other young activists has not been limited to expressions of positive emotion. They've said a lot of scary things. But it's hard to think of anyone who has been more effective. I think one can make a plausible argument. I won't sketch it out here, but I think one can make an argument that the Inflation Reduction Act, which is a law passed in the last couple of years by the Biden administration, that's by far the most important piece of climate legislation in United States history, would not have happened without these young activists and their sometimes doomer messages. So let's talk about action then. What should we do is not a scientific question either, and I don't claim to have authoritative answers, but it admits more pragmatic and constructive responses than how doomed are we. And I think that it behooves climate scientists like me to think a lot harder, a little harder at least, about this question than maybe some of us have. When it comes to the need to stop using fossil fuels, it's straightforward. None of the uncertainties that I've cataloged here really matter or will change that. We know the bad consequences of warming far outweigh the good ones, and we know that we need to cut emissions much faster than we have been if we want to avoid much worse. So no future scientific advances are going to change that fact. Politically, I think we know that collective government action is essential to speed up the clean energy transition. And as citizens, I think we should all be politically engaged and active towards this goal. But if the reason we care about climate is because we care about human well-being, then we should also care about other issues. In particular, I believe that democracy is critically important to all aspects of human well-being, climate included. And so in my view, we should also all support candidates who believe similarly and oppose authoritarianism. And in the United States, we have a very consequential election coming up in November, as you probably are aware, even here. But while collective action is the most critical, personal actions on climate have a role also. Any individual's choices are insignificant to the global carbon budget, but collectively they form part of our culture. The subject here, after all, is ultimately culture, as we heard in the introduction. And culture ultimately helps to motivate collective action. So I am flying less than I used to. The opportunity to speak at this institution was so compelling that I broke a rule I've made for myself that I won't fly just to give a single talk. And I'm eating a mostly vegetarian diet and making some other low-carbon choices to the extent reasonably possible, and I'm talking about them as you hear now. I don't shame anyone else, especially because I know I'm far from perfect, and I know these steps are mostly symbolic. But symbols matter, so I take these steps to make my awareness of the climate problem part of my daily life and to demonstrate to myself and others that I take it seriously. And those of us who are professional climate scientists might consider whether we have or wish to take on a greater responsibility than others. Beyond our personal consumption choices, does our status as those who know the most about the problem give us the power to act through our work? That's a question I have asked myself over the last 10 years. For someone with my expertise, I'm an atmospheric dynamicist. What that means is I study how climate and weather change in response to human-induced warming, but I don't study the carbon cycle itself that causes it. I have come to think that I stand the greatest chance of having a positive impact by working on problems related to climate adaptation. So I showed this picture before. Mitigation, stopping the burning of fossil fuels and other sources of carbon emissions, is critically, essentially important. That's what this picture is meant to illustrate what we need to do to mitigate climate change. So to make a medical analogy, it's treating the underlying cause of the disease to stop burning fossil fuels. But we already know we need to do that, as this graph indicates. And the reasons we are behind where we should be on doing it are political reasons. They're not a consequence of scientific uncertainties. So I've come to the conclusion that the research I personally am most capable of doing is unlikely to make a big difference on mitigation, because what happens now doesn't depend on my science. Adaptation, on the other hand, is like treating the disease's symptoms. In the case of climate, the symptoms are much more complicated than the cause. The impacts of climate change are as diverse and specific as the places and ways in which climate affects human society generally, and addressing those impacts requires equally diverse, specific, and detailed scientific information that we don't, in all cases, have yet. And for me, at least, that's where it's possible for me to work towards answering what should we do and how doomed are we at the same time. So this is the scientific agenda I'm spelling out now. When a state, local, or federal government needs to write a climate adaptation plan, or design new infrastructure, or set policies that influence development in high-risk areas, it needs specific information about the relevant climate risks and how they're changing. Corporations, non-governmental organizations, and community groups need the same to the extent that they are taking any action or doing any planning that accounts for physical climate risk. So demand for this information is growing rapidly as the need to take into account climate is being recognized in an ever-widening sphere of activities. And because extreme events like hurricanes and tornadoes and droughts and heavy rainfall are often how climate change is most sharply manifest, a great need is for information about such events' probabilities and their impacts. And this is what I'm working on most of the time, in fact. So most of the climate information developed by academia and government so far doesn't quite meet this need. It's not specific and detailed enough. The private sector has, in the last few years, rushed into this gap, developing climate risk assessment tools and data sets to inform the insurance and financial industries. But those products are expensive and proprietary, and as democratic governments face politically difficult decisions regarding adaptation, for example, how much should taxpayers in low-risk areas support protection of those in high-risk areas, they will need climate information that has been subject to public scrutiny and debate so that the decisions can be made on the basis of common understanding. So I've come to believe that one constructive thing that academic scientists like me can do is orient our research efforts towards characterizing the changing hazards, risks, and uncertainties at the level of granularity needed for adaptation in the public domain, not the private one, where all the issues can be hashed out openly. In this effort, humility will serve us well. In our research proposals, we climate scientists often state that our goal is to increase understanding so as to reduce uncertainty. But the most challenging and important uncertainties are so resistant to reduction that we can never be confident of success at this, in the near term anyway. So in my view, to support adaptation, we should shift more of our efforts to characterizing uncertainty in ways that effectively inform real-world, near-term decisions. In short, I've come to think that something useful a scientist like me can do is try to respond to the questions, how doomed are we and what should we do, in terms that are pragmatic and supportive of human agency in coping with climate change, while being very clear about the limits of our knowledge. There are countless other possible answers, of course, to what should we do. In case it isn't clear, I don't claim to be an oracle or a role model. The important thing, I think, is to remain engaged. That is, do our best to keep both the climate crisis and the many other dimensions of human and planetary well-being in our view at the same time, both in their global and local dimensions. And try to live our values in ways consistent with those realities as well as we can understand them. And recognize that science has a critical role to play, but it can only take us so far by itself. Thank you very much for your attention.
Ευχαριστούμε πολύ, κύριε καθηγητά, για την πολύ ενδιαφέρουσα πραγματικά ομιλία εδώ στο Εθνικό Αρχαιολογικό Μουσείο. Χαίρομαι πάρα πολύ γιατί το είπατε πολλές φορές, το καταλάβαμε και τον τρόπο που μιλούσατε, ότι δεν μιλούσατε ως μια αυθεντία, παρότι είστε και η έδρα σας στο Κολούμπια θα σας το επέτρεπε κάτι τέτοιο, όμως είναι πολύ σημαντικό οι άνθρωποι να μιλούν με σεμνότητα. Ήταν πολύ ευχάριστο που μπλέξατε την επιστήμη σας και με την πολιτική, γιατί όταν υπάρχουν πολιτικές αποφάσεις πάντοτε επηρεάζουν τους πάντες και τα πάντα. Η επισήμανσή σας ότι έχετε στραφεί στη χορτοφαγία, να σας επισημάνω ότι μετά το ελληνικό Πάσχα, το Ορθόδοξο Πάσχα, όπου γίνεται μεγάλη κατανάλωση κρέατος εδώ στην Ελλάδα, ήταν ενδιαφέρουσα για να μας βάλετε στον σωστό δρόμο, γιατί πράγματι είναι σωστός αυτός ο δρόμος. Τώρα έρχεται η ώρα της σύντομης δικής μας κουβέντας, και το λέω δικής μας ενώ όχι μόνο των δύο, αλλά όλων όσοι είναι εδώ απόψε που θα έχουν την ευκαιρία να σας υποβάλουν ερωτήματα. Να κάνω το πρώτο, μου το επιτρέπει η θέση μου και η χαρά να είμαι κοντά σας. Έκανε μια αναφορά στο τελευταίο μου βιβλίο η διευθύντρια, η κυρία Καραβαναγιώτου, που μιλώ για τα μουσεία influencers. Εκεί λοιπόν εγώ υπερασπίζομαι τη θέση ότι τα μουσεία έχουν μια επιδραστικότητα την οποία αποκτούν και μέσα από το δικό τους παράδειγμα. Όταν ένα μουσείο λοιπόν έρχεται και χρησιμοποιεί αυτή την καθαρή ενέργεια, όπως την λέμε, τις ανανεώσιμες πηγές ενέργειας, αντί το ρεύμα από το στήλο της εταιρείας που πωλεί την ενέργεια, όταν μειώνει την κατανάλωση νερού, όταν δίνει κίνητρα στους εργαζομένους να μην πάρουν το αυτοκίνητό τους για να φτάσουν στη θέση εργασίας τους, αλλά να πάρουν ένα ποδήλατο ή να περπατήσουν λιγάκι και έτσι να μην καταναλώσουν ενέργεια, όταν ακόμα και στα εστιατόρια του χρησιμοποιεί βιολογικά προϊόντα, τότε χωρίς να το διδάξει, χωρίς να το δείξει με το δάκτυλο, με το παράδειγμά του μιλάει και δίνει την κατεύθυνση. Αλλά εγώ δεν είμαι καθηγητής στο Κολούμπια. Συνεπώς, περιμένω να μου πείτε εσείς, που ξέρετε σίγουρα πολλά περισσότερα, πώς ένα μουσείο, για να πάμε και στα μουσεία το 2050, μπορεί να μας δείξει αυτό το πιο πράσινο δρόμο και να συμβάλλει όσο μπορεί με τα μέσα που έχει, με τα εργαλεία που έχει, στο να αγαπήσουμε λίγο περισσότερο τον πλανήτη, να τον σώσουμε, όπως λέμε πιο απλά.
Yeah, wow, that's a tough one. And I should say we ask the same thing within universities. I mean, it's the same question. You mentioned some of the things. I mean, trying to reduce our own impacts through saving energy and water and other natural resources is important. I think they have to be put in perspective with other human needs. But I think maybe the real, since you brought those things up already, maybe what you're really asking is about how the intellectual mission of the place can serve some function. You know, how can institutions which, I can speak from the point of view of the university, and I think museum in some ways maybe is the same. These are institutions that, at least in their historical understanding of them, are devoted to the study of fundamental questions that are scholarly and at the basic level of knowledge, and that don't always have something directly to say about current societal problems. And I think more and more of us are trying to think how we can go beyond that. And you see, you know, me talking to you here shows that we're both trying to do that. And I don't have a good answer. I wish I had a good answer for you. I mean, I gave you my answer for my own work, which is, for most of my career, I was studying how the atmosphere works without worrying about how it would affect anyone, just trying to understand the basics. And maybe that's analogous to studying what happened somewhere thousands of years ago here in Athens without thinking yet about what it has to do with today. But I've tried to find places where I can take my own background and skills and knowledge, and by shifting a little bit, contribute something to the current problem without losing the foundation that makes me have any credibility at all in the first place. I mean, the only reason anybody would listen to me is because I know something about how the climate works. If I stop doing something that's connected to that, then I'm just, I don't have any credibility. So, I mean, So I gave my own answer, which is about trying to provide very specific and local climate information that can be used, which is a somewhat different pursuit than just understanding the atmosphere, but related to it. So for a museum, what is the analog to that? I guess that comes down to the question of how is, what is the relevance of everything we see here, these incredible ancient artifacts. What do they tell us that's relevant to the climate question or other questions today? Or how can we ask slightly different questions than maybe we've asked before, but that still draw on the knowledge that these things give us? So I'm not really answering the question, I realize that, but I'm trying to agree with the spirit of asking it, and I think that's in the university, our previous president called this the fourth purpose, meaning that the first three are research and education and service or something, I forget what the third one is, but the fourth one is going out in the world and trying to do something, which in some sense, I don't know if the word academic, is that a Greek word originally? The word academic in English, it has two meanings. One is something you do in a school, and the other meaning is it's irrelevant. It has no bearing, and it's not an accident because that's how we have organized these institutions, also in Greek. Okay, yeah. And that tells you that academic institutions have thought of themselves as away from the world, and the question is how can we get ourselves closer to the world without losing what makes us special, which is the freedom of inquiry and the kind of intellectual independence that we have. So I don't have an answer, but I think it's a terribly important question, and I think you're starting on the right path here.
Να σας ζωρίσω λίγο, κύριε καθηγητά, να επιμείνω να επανέλθω στο ίδιο περίπου επιχείρημα, γιατί καμιά φορά η γνώση και η λογική έρχονται σε σύγκρουση με τις ανάγκες και τις απαιτήσεις του κόσμου. Ξέρω εδώ η διεύθυνση του μουσείου ότι ο σύγχρονος επισκέπτης θα έρθει εδώ και αναζητά και τις οθόνες και τη νέα τεχνολογία και όλα αυτά, και με την ανακαίνιση του μουσείου και με την επέκτασή του θα προσθεθούν πολύ περισσότερο, δηλαδή όλα αυτά τα αριστουργήματα τα οποία δεν ζυγίζονται, δεν μετριώνται, λένε πολλά πράγματα. Όμως πια ο επισκέπτης θέλει να του πεις κι άλλα και άλλα και άλλα και ζητά τεχνολογία. Ακόμα και πίσω σας στρέψετε το κεφάλι σας, υπάρχει ένα QR code, δηλαδή στην καλύτερη περίπτωση θα πας στο κινητό τηλέφωνο, στο έξυπνο τηλέφωνο για να κάνεις τη δουλειά σου και να ξαναγεθείς. Όλο αυτό θέλει και ενέργεια, θέλει και κατανάλωση πόρων, όλο αυτό συγκρούεται με αυτά τα οποία λέτε ότι πρέπει να κάνουμε για να προστατεύσουμε το περιβάλλον. Πώς λοιπόν θα βάλουμε και ένα φρένο στις ορέξεις μας, στις απαιτήσεις, πώς θα δημιουργήσουμε ένα νέο πλαίσιο που θα κάνει τον απαιτητικό άνθρωπο, προκειμένου τον απαιτητικό επισκέπτη, ικανοποιημένο, αλλά δεν θα το κάνει εις βάρος του δικού του μέλλοντος των παιδιών του, των εγγονιών του.
Right. Well, I mean, I guess what you're saying is that all this new technology, the concern is that it's using more energy or more resources. Is that the concern you're raising? I mean, I guess it's worth some effort to try to understand to what extent that's true. I mean, how much more resources really is it using? And then to weigh that against the benefits. I mean, one thing I was trying to say, maybe I could have spent more time at it, is that I think climate can't be the only issue. I mean, it can't be the only thing we think about. I mean, for example, on the international arena, as nations argue about I mean, for example, fossil fuels, as much as they're the cause of the problem, they also provide energy that we all need to live. We can't get rid of them immediately, although I think we should be trying to get rid of them as immediately as we can. And on the international negotiations, you have the world trying to reduce carbon emissions, but you have the countries that are poorer countries that have burned much less carbon in the past, saying that they shouldn't be subject to the same restrictions as we, the rich countries that have caused much more of the problem. The United States is particularly, bad, and that we should have greater restrictions on us because, there is some benefit to having energy, and renewable energy doesn't yet provide everyone's needs. So they have a point, and I guess all I'm saying is that if the reason we care about climate is because we care about the impacts on people, then we have to balance climate against other considerations. I think it's so important to try to solve the problem by using less carbon, but at the same time, climate is not the only thing that affects people, so we have to balance these considerations. I mean, for the museum, of course, if the concern about the new technologies that it uses more energy, I mean, if the energy were coming from clean sources, then it wouldn't be such a problem, right? So it's connected to a national and global agenda in that way. So I don't know. I just think that it's important to think about these resource and energy and climate considerations at the same time as thinking about all the other goals. If we become absolutist about it, then we're somehow, I think, making our agenda too narrow.
Κάνοντας εγώ μια βόλτα στο μουσείο, αν προσπαθώ να το συνδέσω, τις σκέψεις μου να τις συνδέσω με το περιβάλλον, είναι ότι οι αρχαίοι έχουν δημιουργήσει τόσο πολλά αριστουργήματα, υπάρχει ένα παρελθόν, υπάρχει μια ιστορία και είναι πολύ κρίμα εξαιτίας των δικών μας επιλογών και των πολιτικών, τις επισημάνετε κι εσείς, αλλά και των ανθρωπίνων επιλογών, γιατί και εμείς επιλέγουμε τους πολιτικούς μας και οι πολιτικοί κάπως συμμορφώνονται με τα δικά μας θέλω και τη δική μας στάση ζωής. Είναι λοιπόν πολύ κρίμα να σταματήσει κάπου εδώ όλο αυτό ο ανθρώπινος πολιτισμός, επειδή τα έχουμε βάλει τόσο πολύ με την φύση. Εσείς που έχετε διδάξει τα μεγαλύτερα πανεπιστήμια του κόσμου, έχετε μπει σε αμφιθέατρα, μιλάτε στη νέα γενιά, τι σκέψεις κάνετε όταν μιλάτε για το κλίμα και άρα για το μέλλον μας, σε ένα τέτοιο χώρο όπως είναι το μεγαλύτερο και το σπουδαιότερο μουσείο της Ελλάδας?
Wow, yeah, that culture and civilization might end because of our choices. I mean, that's the theme, right? Are we doomed? And it's tremendously scary, but I think one has to keep a sense of agency. I mean, one has to keep a sense that we can do things. I mean, we have some, I don't think we're completely doomed yet. I mean, there's still time to keep under some emissions targets and then try to cope with, to adapt to what we can't, the climate change that has already happened, that we can't stop. There's some people emphasize the possibility for new technologies that will enable us even to reduce the problem again by pulling carbon out of the air and actually reverse climate change. We don't have that technology yet in any affordable way, and I think we shouldn't wait for it to come, but it's possible. So I think the only thing one can do is try to maintain some sense of agency, to recognize the choices that we have, try to find the best ones, and look at it that way. I mean, if a feeling of fear helps to motivate people, then I think it's fine. But if it's paralyzing, if it stops us from doing anything, then it's not productive. We can't always control how we feel, but we can try to react in the most constructive ways. I don't know any better than that.
Ευχαριστώ πάρα πολύ. Να ρωτήσω αν υπάρχει κάποιος ή κάποια που επιθυμεί να υποβάλει κάποιο ερώτημα στον καθηγητή. Δεν έχουμε την ευκαιρία κάθε μέρα να συναντάμε τον καθηγητή εδώ. Θα έρθει το μικρόφωνο τώρα και θα το υποβάλλετε. Θα μας συστηθείτε μόνο και θα σας ακούσουμε.
Λέγομαι Νίκος Μουρτζάς, είμαι γεωλόγος και ασχολούμαι με τις μεταβολές στο επίπεδο της θάλασσας. Καταρχήν να ευχαριστήσω τον καθηγητή για την ωραία του ομιλία. Το πρώτο θέμα, το οποίο πραγματικά ήταν εξαιρετικά εύστοχο, ήταν η σύνδεση της πολιτικής και του κλίματος. Πραγματικά, μέσα τουλάχιστον από τη δική μου ερευνητική πορεία, κατάλαβα ένα πράγμα, ότι παραδείγματος χάρη η λέξη κλιματική κρίση είναι μια πολιτική έννοια, ενώ η κλιματική αλλαγή είναι μια διαδικασία φυσική. Η πολιτική, όταν μιλάμε για κλιματική κρίση, μιλάμε για την ανεπάρκεια του πολιτικού συστήματος να μπορέσει να αντιμετωπίσει τις επιπτώσεις της κλιματικής αλλαγής. Και όταν μιλάμε για κλιματική αλλαγή, μιλάμε για κάποιες φυσικές στις οποίες υπησέρχονται οι ανθρωπογενείς διαδικασίες, οι οποίες αλλάζουν σταδιακά το κλίμα. Τους τελευταίους αιώνες μετά τη βιομηχανική επανάσταση πολύ πιο γρήγορα, αλλά ξέρουμε ότι και η φυσική ιστορία πάντα συνέδε την αύξηση του διοξιδίου του άνθρακος με φυσικές διεργασίες, τουλάχιστον τα 500.000 τελευταία χρόνια, με την αύξηση της θερμοκρασίας και με την αύξηση του επίπεδου της θάλασσας. Άρα, καταρχήν, αυτή την έννοια είναι καθαρά πολιτική και βλέπουμε πώς συνδέεται η πολιτική με το κλίμα άμεσα. Ένα δεύτερο σημείο το οποίο επισημάνατε είναι ότι υπάρχει η αβεβαιότητα στην επιστήμη. Προφανώς υπάρχει αβεβαιότητα στην επιστήμη, γιατί υπάρχει η έλλειψη της γνώσης, η οποία σταδιακά εξελίσσεται και πάντα θα εξελίσσεται και θα ανακαλύπτει καινούριους χώρους μέσα στη γνώση. Είναι βασικό όμως ότι υπάρχουν κάποια αντικειμενικές συνθήκες μέσα σε αυτή την έρευνα την οποία κάνουμε. Δηλαδή, η αύξηση του διοξιδίου του άνθρακος επιφέρει αύξηση της θερμοκρασίας. Αυτό είναι κάτι αντικειμενικό, το βλέπουμε, το έχουμε και πειραματικά και πρακτικά αποδείξει. Ότι η αύξηση της θερμοκρασίας λιώνει τους πάγους είναι και αυτό μια αντικειμενική αλήθεια. Ότι η συσσόρευση υγρού στοιχείου μέσα στους ωκεανούς και αυτό αυξάνει το επίπεδο της θάλασσας. Επίσης βλέπουμε μέσα από τις καμπύλες τις οποίες όλοι έχουμε μελετήσει, αλλά και με τις σύγχρονες, παραδείγματος χάρη, τις τηλεσκοπικές μεθόδους μέτρησης της μεταβολής του επίπεδου της θάλασσας, βλέπουμε ότι αυτή ανεβαίνει και έχει κατακλείσει σε πολύ μεγάλο τμήμα της ξηράς τα τελευταία, ακόμη μέσα στον Ολόκενο όταν μιλάμε, δηλαδή τα τελευταία 6.000 χρόνια. Στην Ελλάδα έχουμε δει ότι αυτή η μεταβολή έχει φτάσει στα 6-6,5 μέτρα, ότι έχει κατακλείσει μεγάλο μέρος της παλαιάς ξηράς, επειδή μιλάμε για μια χώρα η οποία περιβάλλεται με θάλασσα και με ένα σημαντικό νησιωτικό σύμπλεγμα. Έτσι. Έχει κατακλείσει την ξηρά τουλάχιστον κατά 200 μέτρα και βλέπουμε ότι και οι μελλοντικές αλλαγές που μέσα από τα μοντέλα μας και μελετάμε, αλλά και μέσα από τα μοντέλα τα οποία προέρχονται και από τη δικιά μας παρατήρηση, πέρα από το γενικότερο μοντέλο, θα έχουμε μια αύξηση του επίπεδου της θάλασσας, μια αύξηση της θερμοκρασίας, μια αύξηση του επίπεδου της θάλασσας και ένα κίνδυνο για την νησιωτικότητα και για τις ακτές της Ελλάδος. Και όταν ερχόμαστε στο θέμα των αρχαίων μνημείων, οι οποίοι, ξέρετε ότι ήταν ένας ναυτικός πολιτισμός η Ελλάδα. Είχε αναπτύξει εκατοντάδες, μην πω χιλιάδες οικισμούς παράκτιους. Αυτή τη στιγμή όλα αυτά βρίσκονται σε κίνδυνο. Ένα παράδειγμα να σας δώσω, ότι μια τελευταία έρευνα που κάνουμε για το νησί της Δήλου δείχνει ότι η κατάκληση μέσα από μοντέλα πρακτικά τα οποία έχουμε υπολογίσει με παρατηρήσεις κατά το παρελθόν πόσο μεταβάλλεται το επίπεδο της θάλασσας, ότι αυτή τη στιγμή ένα τεράστιο μέρος του αρχαιολογικού χώρου της Δήλου μέχρι το 2050 θα έχει κατακλειστεί. Αυτή τη στιγμή έχουν κατακλειστεί πάρα πολλά στρέμματα του αρχαιολογικού χώρου, 150 στρέμματα του αρχαιολογικού χώρου της Δήλου. Άρα δηλαδή βλέπουμε ότι υπάρχει μια αντικειμενικότητα στην επιστήμη και μια πραγματικά αβεβαιότητα όσον αφορά το μέγεθος του κινδύνου. Και θα συμφωνήσω απόλυτα με εσάς. Και πάλι θα σας ευχαριστήσω.
Thank you.
Δεν υπάρχει σχόλιο. Μας καλύψατε και τον καθηγητή. Κύριε καθηγητά, ευχαριστούμε πολύ που ήσασταν εδώ στο Εθνικό Αρχαιολογικό Μουσείο και μας δώσατε την ευκαιρία να σας απολαύσουμε και τη διάλεξή σας και την κουβέντα που κάναμε. Να ευχαριστήσουμε πολύ και το Marketing Greece, το Radisson, το ξενοδοχείο και κάποιοι άνθρωποι και κάποιοι φορείς βοήθησαν για να είμαστε όλοι εδώ και βεβαίως για την υποστήριξη την εταιρεία των φίλων του Εθνικού και Αρχαιολογικού Μουσείου που πάντοτε παίζει πάρα πολύ σημαντικό ρόλο σε όλες τις εκδηλώσεις και στην πορεία του μουσείου και μακάρι η εταιρεία των φίλων να μας πιάσει όλους, έτσι, δηλαδή θέλω να πω όλους τους Αθηναίους. Το κανονικό θα ήταν να είμαστε όλοι φίλοι του Εθνικού και Αρχαιολογικού Μουσείου. Να είστε όλες και όλοι καλά. Ευχαριστούμε πάρα πολύ.